Oh, well, thank you very much. I mean, giving me the opportunity. Um, Actually, it's probably good for the numbers we've got that we didn't have Shane coming because it would have been a bit of a waste, I think. But anyway, this talk comes around like I think so many of our investigations. When you go down a rabbit hole and you find things and you keep going and you keep going and you keep going and you end up finding lots and lots of information you had no idea was there in the first place. So this is the story of she was born Fanny Lucy Radmore, the fourth daughter and ninth of 10 children of Thomas Radmore, who was a warehouseman, and Maria Isabella Clark. They married in June 1840, by which time they already had two children and a third on the way. So maybe that's conventional for the time. You will find I keep flipping between Fanny Lucy and Lucy Fanny because that's what she did. And it's the same person, believe me. And she was born at 13 Lower Kennington Green. Now, for the talk to work, we've got to establish that she was actually a Cockney sparrow. And of course, the criteria is you're born within the sound of Bow Bells. That's where the church is, put it that way. And that's where she was born, about 2.5 miles apart. So back in 1857, the answer is yes. You could hear the sound of Bow Bells from where she's born. Today, maybe at 2 o'clock in the morning, you might, but there's too much road noise. And of course, you've got planes going in and out of Heathrow, which wasn't the issue back then. Oval Cricket Ground is down there, and that was actually in place when she was born. Okay, so I'm looking at where the family were living. 1841, they're up here, Bell and Mouth Street. 1851, they're over here in Shoe Lane. In 1861, they're on Newgate Street. As you can see, you can't get much more central than that. St Paul's Cathedral around the back, and you've got the prison, Newgate Prison there, which is about 100 yards away. Last public execution there took place in 1868 when Fanny Lucy Radmore would have been about 11. And I find it difficult to believe that she wouldn't have seen one, at least one, because they were great spectacles. People used to go along. And if you're that age, I reckon you would have made sure you saw one. They stopped using the prison in 1902 and it was demolished in 1904. Any references to the place I found in the 1890s are mainly in trade directories. There appeared not to be that many people living in that street. But in the 1861 census, when she was 4, it records 13 people living in that particular place. Now, immediate reaction is, oh dear, back-to-backs, all crammed in. Not actually the case because they had 2 servants. So there was clearly, it appeared to be accommodation above the warehouse. And I checked as well, they weren't just being economical with the truth. Most of the neighbours had at least a servant as well. So the accommodation would appear to be reasonably spacious. And you see by the early 1900s, this thing worked. Oh, just about, sorry, the batteries must be going. Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey has replaced the old prison. I then looked to see, well, I wonder if I can find a later picture of that particular street. And yeah, I can. Late December 1940, south side of Newgate Street. They were on the south side. Now they'd long moved out, but the whole place was demolished. And today, if you go down there, lots of steel and glass. The stock exchange is on the corner. So this is the location, the start point for what is, frankly, a quite incredible journey of a lady from, yeah, she was from the East End. I mean, there's just no two ways about it. Part of the issue I've found is that a lot of the information we have comes from her, either directly or indirectly. And of course, that means you get the version of history that she wanted portrayed. You know, like Churchill said, history will treat me kindly. I know, I intend to write it. And he did, didn't he? But yes, you've documentary evidence is a little bit on the thin side. Um, you know, the richer you are, probably the bigger mark you leave on history. The relatively poor people don't leave much of a trace. This is a picture of Lucy. I don't know what age she is there, but you'll see from one or two of the later pictures, she does seem to age very well. So I don't know. Yeah, it does, doesn't she? You know, it looks, but then it's not clear why she'd have had a photo taken when she was a teenager. I simply don't know. Maybe there's some money there. 1870, 1870, she acted as the witness to her sister's marriage. She was 13 at that time. Her parents were both still alive. So we're going to question why. I mean, her sister was of full age. There wasn't anything untoward there. But why would she ask her sister to come act as the witness? Again, we don't know. Sometime 2 or 3 years later, again, slightly unclear, when she was about 16, but might well have only been 15 or 14, she met and became the mistress of a gentleman called Fred Gretton. Now, as we learnt last month, the age of consent for girls was 12 at that stage, had been for 600 odd years from the time of Edward II, I think it is. There are no known photos of Fred Gretton, unfortunately. Whether he was just ugly or camera shy or whatever, we don't know. She was, we believe, a chorus girl, and that's possibly how they met. Maybe she and a few of her friends were performing at a party for Fred and his mates. So the question is, Fred, you know, he's more than twice her age, which sounds a little bit dodgy. Who was he? Well, he was the second son of a gentleman called John Gretton, who'd owned a brewery. In 1835, John Gretton became a partner in what became known as Bass, Ratcliffe, and Gretton. Later, Bass. If you look carefully, there's something slightly wrong there. The crate in the picture is about 2¼ inches by about 1¼ inches. It was made for Queen Mary's Doll's House in about 1924. But it illustrates the name Bass, Ratcliffe and Gretton. Later on, it became just Bass. There's one or two sort of odd things I found whilst researching here. The Trademark Registration Act came in place in 1875. And the very first trademark, 1st of January 1876, was this one. As you can just see, trademark #1, which is still used. So that's the very first trademark. About that time, Bass became the largest brewery in the world. And the calculations I've gone through indicates their annual output was enough to give everybody in the world a cupful. Now, It's impractical. You couldn't distribute a cupful to everybody in the world because it'd be flat by the time you got it there. But it tells you the scale of the operation. And another side note, Fred's older brother, who was also called John, became chairman of BAS and is the only sitting MP who won an Olympic gold medal, which he did in the 1900 Paris Games. In fact, he won two, and they're both for sailing. There you are. Fred, when his father died when he was about in his 20s. Fred inherited a 1/8 share of the business. Now, from what I told you about the size of the brewery, that made him seriously wealthy very quickly. He did work for the company to start with, but he didn't seem to didn't enamor him. And with that amount of money, he developed a stable of racehorses. And one of them is this one, Isonomy. Now, frankly, that could be any horse, but I am told that is a painting of Isonomy. He was a fairly astute cookie because the horse was quite good as a 2-year-old. Most horses, I'm not a racing expert, but most horses, they put them into the derby and things like that when they're 3. He didn't. When it was a 4-year-old, he entered it with a handicap and he won £42,000. In that money, about 5 million in today's terms, because it appeared, without the internet, without everybody sharing information, people had forgotten this was quite a good horse. Yeah, so Fred and Fanny Lucy, they were a couple. She referred to herself as Mrs. Gretton at times, although they were never married. They spent, you can say they enjoy the high life. Well, why wouldn't you if you've earned, won the equivalent of 5 million on one horse race? They spent time in Paris, met the then Prince of Wales, who also enjoyed his time in Paris. Sadly, Fred seemed to enjoy the drink a little bit too much. And when he was 42, he died of drink-related illnesses. At the time, this was their London residence, Thurlow Square, which you can see is not exactly a shabby address. Natural History Museum, Victoria and Albert Museum. When he died, in his will, he left her £6,000 a year for life, roughly equivalent to £750,000 in today's terms. Fair to say the family weren't that thrilled because his behaviour had led some adverse publicity, but they challenged the will, but the will was fine, it was legal. So there she is with £750,000 a year for life. Now, if you're the wife of a Premiership footballer, you might think that's a bit on the tight side, but I think most of us would agree we could muddle through on £750,000. House in Thurlow Square, yeah, 1-bed apartments go for over £1 million these days. That's the actual house. As I said, it does beat living above the warehouse. Just. The house next door to theirs sold for 13.7 million about 3 years ago. So she hasn't done badly for herself so far. Now, she decided she wanted a stage career. I mean, what are you going to do? You're seriously wealthy, you're still relatively young. And she got a part in a play. She called herself, what did she call herself? Let me find out. Stage name of, notes, Lucy Grafton. Don't know why. part in a play at the Theatre Royal Drury Lane, which you might be aware, that entrance is not in Drury Lane at all. The back entrance is in Drury Lane. So quite why it's got that, unless they've turned it around over the years, I'm not sure. I have to wonder whether she actually financed part of the production, because plays like today, you need backers because you don't know whether they're going to be successful or not. 3 weeks into the production, she eloped with this gentleman. Theodore Brinkman. It's a picture of him in later life. He did subsequently become a baronet. And they married only 10 months after the death of Fred. This is all a bit quick, like, what is going on here? Suggestion is she told him she was pregnant. And of course, being a fine, upstanding gentleman, he would do the honourable thing. She wasn't pregnant. Well, if she was, she never had any children. The relationship, next slide. First marriage certificate here. So we've got him at 21, her at 24. Well, actually, she's 26, but hey, a couple of years. Also at the bottom here, she's claiming her father, now deceased, was a gentleman, which is stretching the truth beyond the point of elasticity, frankly, because he wasn't. A gentleman was, a man of independent means and all the rest of it. No, he was a warehouseman. But anyway, they were married. About 3 years into the relationship, they separated, formally separated a little bit after that. And in 1895, they were divorced. It was one of only 407 divorces in that year. 100 years later, the figure is 155,000 divorces in the year. They obviously seem to have a sort of mania for doing things quickly, because Theodore married 3 months after the divorce went through. And again, one of these quirky things, it prompted a change in church law. In that moment in the marriage ceremony when they say, if anyone knows any due cause why these two should not be married, people stood up and said, yes, his lawfully wedded wife is still alive. Now, it was sort of, sit down, we're going ahead anyway. But as a result, church law was changed, so a vicar could not be required to hold a marriage ceremony if he had objections to marrying divorcees in his church. The Brinkman family set up a trust for Lucy, enable her to buy a house. As you can see, not just any house, 10-bedroomed apartment, a house rather. 4-bed apartment sell for 10 million these days. BBC is at the end of the road. Wasn't the BBC then, of course. And I found a house, the other side was listed with Sotheby's, not Purple Bricks or any of the other cheap, low, for 65 million. You have to say, I don't know whether it's a Cockney sparrow, it's a cat more than it. Always seems to land on her feet at this point. Husband number 2. He was the 9th Baron Byron. Now you're third. Oh, Lord Byron. Yep, Lord Byron was the 6th Baron. He was the one who was referred to by one of his lovers as mad, bad, and dangerous to know. And we're now on the 13th. Now, the thing about the 9th Baron, he was a confirmed bachelor, but he was broke. He was he fell victim to a con. I think he underwrote somebody's rather substantial bank loan. When it all went pear-shaped, the loan was called in, and that meant that he was broke. So she actually proposed to him. So it was quite unusual, but, you know, why not? Yeah, I've just really the grounds for the divorce from husband number one were adultery and well, basically adultery. But he had spent 3 nights at a hotel in Brighton with a lady who was not his wife. So he accepted the responsibility, and that's possibly why his family felt obliged to look after the wronged woman. Now, so she's now Baroness Byron. And of course, that gives you a certain status, doesn't it? This is the second marriage certificate. So he's 45, which he is. And she's not 36 at all. She's 43. So she is really quite creative. She's still sticking to the story that her father was a gentleman. But I suppose if you're trying to marry a baron, you're not going to say, yeah, he was a warehouseman, common tradesman. You're not really going to say that, are you? It's sort of, okay, yeah, the little writing says the marriage of the, it's Fanny Lucy Brad, I think it says Broadhead actually, then Radmore, spinster with Theodore Brinkman, having been dissolved on the 14th of January 1895. So yeah, at that stage, why is she not the name by which she was born? And that's recorded on the marriage certificate. So she's still claiming to be, at this stage, Broadhead. Well, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. The Langham Hotel, which is where, wasn't that where Kate's parents, Catherine's parents stayed the night before? Yeah. It's just round the back of Buckingham Palace, isn't it? Yeah. So there you are. Yeah. So she's now a baroness. And of course, if you're a baroness, you get invited to a coronation, don't you? To their, presumably their great mate, who's now Edward VII, with all the high-ranking nobles. Time for a new dress, I reckon. And find a few pearls, things like that. Picture of her in 1909. So at this stage, you know, she is 53. Is it? Yeah, I mean, I think she ages incredibly well. You know, she must have a terrific bone structure and obviously a good figure. I mean, there's probably a lot of corset there. Yeah, she probably couldn't sit down even if she wanted to. But there you are. And of course, shortly afterwards, another coronation. So I reckon it's another new dress. But, you know, let's face it, she could afford it. It wasn't too much of an issue. She became quite active. Member of the Women's Social and Political Union. Suffragette. She actually stood bail for Mrs. Pankhurst and one or two of the others when they were up in front of the beak for various misdemeanors. She was also involved in the planning of Hampstead Garden suburb. If we go back, the marriage certificate, she was living in Hampstead, or that's what she said at the time of the marriage. She certainly embraced alternative health regimes because she was very much a fan of fresh air. You know, it was one of the things at the time. But as the war started, she got involved in a couple of campaigns um, sending matches to the troops where the label said, "Matches for our matchless troops from Lady Byron." And another one was, "Give him socks." Because she'd found out that one of the things the soldiers said they most wanted was a clean, dry pair of socks. So she was involved in that. Um, so, it's again, those are the suffragette colours. I mean, that's a picture of Pankhurst. Yeah. Yeah, those are the white, the green, and the purple, and they are significant, aren't they? But it also there's something about white for purity, and yeah, okay, okay, right. Thank you. I've learned something. Sadly, 1917, Byron died, and we have a picture of her age 60, and again, incredible, isn't it? Really. I, she does look amazing. Yeah, she was awarded a DBE, which I think is significant because it's the first time she's really been recognised in her own right, rather than as the significant other of somebody better known, more famous, more wealthy, or whatever. Um, this is the house they called Bluebird's Nest. It was a rest home for nurses who had been serving on the Western Front. Still exists, obviously, otherwise I managed to nab a photo of it. It backs onto Hampstead Heath, which you can just about see down the side of the house there. So, I think that's significant, really, that she's managing to establish her own identity